Paul Walbeck, Dean of the George Washington University Columbian College of Arts and Sciences. Today, I'm talking with Nima Blyden, Professor of History and International Affairs and author of the book African Americans in Africa, A New History, recently out in paperback. She also contributed to In Motion, the African American Migration Experience, a project sponsored by the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture of the New York Public Library. Welcome, Dr. Blyden.
Thanks, Paul. It's nice to be here.
So let's start with your new book. Tell me about it.
So this is a book that looks at African American engagement with the continent of Africa. It's a long sweep, 400 years, that tries to ask the question of what Africa means to African Americans. And that question, which was a question sort of put by the poet County Cullen in the 1920s, what is Africa to me, has been answered by African Americans over the centuries in different ways. And this is what I try to explore in the book, how Africa figures, both in real ways, but also in imagined ways for African Americans.
So what are some of the key takeaways for what Africa means to African Americans?
So I think a large part of the story that I tell is that African American history in this country, which as we know is filled with oppression, it's filled with some negative aspects, which we've seen, I think, in the last couple of years, even in our time, has motivated some African Americans to think about whether or not they're welcome or they belong in this country. And Africa has been a place that they've looked to as an outlet, if you will, or as a place, an imagined place for most that they can engage with. Part of the story that I also tell is of those African Americans who reject that notion, right? Who claim their Americanness, who insist on their right to belong in this country. And I think if there's a takeaway, I think it's that I want for people to understand the ways in which African Americans have made a claim to their rights as American citizens.
So your research examines questions that are fundamental to African American culture and history. So can you elaborate on your findings?
So a lot of what I talk about in this book, because of its connection with African history, is what of Africa has remained in African American culture. And I do this as I look at African American history through the centuries, from looking at the enslaved population and what cultural, religious, political aspects they brought with them from Africa directly, and then look at what remained, cultural aspects, language, food, religious practices that remained in African American history and culture.
So you mentioned that African Americans brought with them some religious practices, food, other cultural practices from Africa. Can you elaborate on what some of those are?
So some of the things that we look at, and you know, over the centuries, those practices change. So if you look at the early period when people were brought directly from the continent of Africa, they brought their foodways, so the cooking of particular dishes, the types of food which they ate, you know, black-eyed peas, for example, which we associate with the South, is a food that we know was an influence that was brought by African-descended populations. Their religious practices, various African religious practices, which meld some with Christianity, some continue to be practiced independently by enslaved populations. These are some of the things that I try to look at to understand what elements of Africa remained. Language, today my students are reading a book that looks at African cultural retentions, and so things like language, like the word tote, for example, which we associate, right, with a tote bag, which means to carry. That was an African word that remained in the American language. So trying to pick at things which, for a long time, perhaps scholars did not connect with Africa, but that we now know were African cultural elements in African American history and culture.
So there's a lot of continuity from the African traditions to what we have here in the United States today.
Absolutely, and they change, and one doesn't want to generalize. There were regional differences. Obviously, African populations came from various parts of the continent and came here, and some of it got mixed with each other, but also mixed with European cultures. And of course, over the centuries, we've lost a lot of that. But there are places, like, for example, the Gullah Geechee people, who still retain significant elements of African cultural ways, if you will, to generalize. Perhaps in the North, we don't have as much cultural retention as we might have in some southern areas, absolutely.
So it's fascinating to hear how African traditions have carried over into the United States.
Yes.
Has that changed over the decades or centuries? Or are there some areas, whether it be food or religious practices or music, that have come and gone, some over the years?
I would say yes. I mean, some perhaps may not be recognizable as African cultural practices or ways. I guess depending on the community, I mean, we typically associate the southern cultures, right, as having more vestiges of Africa. So the practices have changed. They've become, in sort of academic parlance, creolized, right, mixing with whether Native American cultural aspects or European cultural aspects. But I think that, African Americans do recognize elements of Africa in their ways still.
So over time, connections to Africa probably loosened. To what extent do you see that in your research?
Absolutely. I mean, when we talk about the enslaved population, there's a certain point, probably by the 19th century, maybe early 19th century, but certainly by the mid-19th century, where most people of African descent who were enslaved were now American-born, right? So many of them had lost, right, elements of Africa, if you want to call it that, elements that perhaps their parents, who, if they were not African-born, were at least closely tied to those who were African-born, as enslaved African Americans or free Black African Americans moved further away, either from slavery if you were free or if you were enslaved from your African past. Their ways changed. They became, as I said, creolized. They became African American, as we would call them now, right, where their practices would be distinct from that of their African-born predecessors. So we absolutely see that pattern happening in enslavement in the early period and later period, of course, where by the time we get to the 20th century, many African Americans don't even recognize some of what they do as being connected to Africa.
So there's a lot of interest, especially in recent years, in migrations within the United States of African Americans. Books like Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of the Other Sun, for instance. So what explains patterns of migration or decisions to move from one part of the country to another?
So, I mean, I think that, scholars have looked at a variety of reasons why, and Wilkerson's book is excellent in that way, in the way she traces the migration of different people from different regions to the South to other parts of the United States, North and West, of course. And, in the period after slavery, of course, we know that many Southerners moved out of the South for economic reasons, for political reasons, because of the violence that many scholars have chronicled against African American people in southern states in the post-Reconstruction era. So there are a whole host of reasons that we can talk about that prompted African Americans to leave the South in search of a better life.
So what's next for your research agenda?
Yeah. So all my work is sort of focused on connections between Africa and its diaspora. My next project is actually I'm calling it a family biography, but it's a book that attempts to look at various spaces in Africa and the African diaspora, including the United States, through the eyes of one family. And it spans the late 18th to, well, I'm stopping at the 20th century, but really could take it up to the 21st century.
And so you're going to be examining then a family and the path. So any hints as to what you're going to find?
So I've begun to look, and I should. It's not a spoiler, but I should say it's my family history, and so I'm looking at, for example, right now my current research is looking at the late 18th century in a small Caribbean island called St. Eustatius, where the earliest family that we can trace were born in the 1790s. At that time, it was a Dutch colony. So I'm finding out lots of information about Dutch slavery in the Caribbean.
Can you explain how your work on the African diaspora would affect the experience of African Americans today?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I talk about in the book is the ways in which we think about who an African American is today. Large migration of people from the Caribbean and the African continent, of course, are now citizens, residents of the United States, which has expanded to some extent the definition of who an African American is. The African American community, if you want to call it that, I call them communities, has never been monolithic. We've always had variations in our cultural practices, based on where we were born. If you were born in Massachusetts as an African American, your life history probably was different from if you were born in, say, Mississippi in the South. And so I think we're seeing that today with new populations of people of African descent who get classified as African American, which has broadened to some extent, I would argue, the definition of African American.
So you've described a wealth of research on the African diaspora and its impact on African Americans here in the United States. How did you conduct this research? Where did you go for the sources? What did you use?
The book was actually based on a class that I had taught for many years. And so it came out of a course that I had taught. But the newspaper sources, the African American newspaper sources, and we have those databases here on our campus, were very useful to me because it allowed me to access voices of everyday African Americans asking this question of what is Africa to me? And so I think that would be where I would say what I would say for new things that I discovered and that were useful to me.
Well, I love hearing that this project came out of a class that you were teaching.
It did.
So how have the students responded to this discussion in classes?
Very well. I'm actually teaching that course this semester. So I have found it to be a class that students really interested in because they've come across African American history before. Many of them have taken African American history before. But I think the idea of what Africa, or how Africa prefigures in the life and history and imagination and consciousness of African Americans is not often a question that students have asked themselves. And so it's quite interesting to have students, particularly students who come from various backgrounds, African Americans, students who are children of immigrants as well, and so they come to it asking different questions.
So if asking that question is a relatively new phenomenon, when did that start?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a new phenomenon because it's a question, as I say, has been asked for centuries, but I think for our younger students, perhaps, that's not necessarily a question they might have asked. If you're the child of a Ghanaian immigrant, right? You clearly have an answer to the question, "What is Africa to me?" Right? But if you're descendant of an enslaved person from South Carolina, let's say, that may not be a question. Well, maybe South Carolina is not that great an example since there's so many elements of Africa in South Carolina. But say from, I don't know, Worcester, Massachusetts. My mother was born in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I start the book with the story of my parents. When they meet, my mother doesn't know anything about Africa. Right? And so that question never occurred to her. She never thought to ask a question of what is Africa to me. And I still think that that's true for many of our young students today.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights into the African diaspora and its impact on our communities here in the United States. Clearly, given your discussion of your family and the impact of this on even your own parents, it's clearly a very important topic, and thank you for sharing your research with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This was fantastic.